Sixth grade, welcome to History Lesson 2. Yesterday we learned what historians do. We talked about archaeology and digging up artifacts, and paleontology and studying fossils, and anthropology and looking at the culture of the different people that are out there. We talked about timelines and calendars and how we have the dates, how they started with the Julian calendar with Julius Caesar. We still honor him with the month of July today. The next Caesar was Caesar Augustus. That's where we get the month of August from. Today we use the Gregorian calendar from the Pope in the 1500s that did that. And trying to fix the problems of our 365, but not quite. Lesson 2. The title of Lesson 2 says, how does a historian work? The essential question is, how do we learn about the past? So we want to figure out what's going on there. And then it matters because knowing how historians works helps us understand this historical information that we're going to be looking at this year, and being able to understand and look at something critically and say, hey, what does the historian look at? And then should I believe the conclusions they gathered from those things? If you're using your hardcover books, guys, you can see that you'd be on page 10. Those of you who have logged in online, we're ready to rock and roll. I'm already on lesson 2 with you. You should have your pieces of paper out. One, says Discovering the Past, the note pages from 10 to 15. Some of you might have your other assignments sitting alongside that you can multitask and knock all those things out. It reads like this. Historian asks questions about the information they find from the past. Why did some nations go to war? How were the people affected by that war? How did the events of the past change people's lives? These questions help us focus on historical problems. To learn the answer to these historical questions, historians look for evidence. Evidence is something that shows proof or an indication that something is true. Evidence could be in the form of material objects, such as a soldier's uniform or scraps of pottery from an archaeological dig. Other evidence may appear in documents or written materials that were created during a historical event. Historians use the evidence they read in historical sources to interpret what happened in the past. So you can see as we're cruising along here, make sure you have your notes going on. You should have had numbers 1, 2, and 3 answered there, along with a couple of the vocabulary words that we are getting into. So what it's just simply saying is historians have to, as they look at things, draw some conclusions from that. But one of the biggest things they have to do is say, hey, what can I, when I look at something, know for sure is true because of this? And we're going to, as we go this year, constantly look at things to say, hey, do I agree? Is this definitely fact and true, or is this more of opinion? We'll move on to the type of sources that they can have. Historians look for clues about the past in primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are first-hand pieces of evidence. They were written or created by the people who saw or experienced an event. Primary sources include letters, diaries, or government records. Literature or artwork from a particular time and place can be a primary source. Spoken interviews and objects such as tools and clothing are also primary sources. Primary sources help historians learn what people were thinking while the events took place. They use the sources to find evidence that explains historical events. Okay, so the first source we're talking about is primary sources. They are first-hand accounts. In other words, the people witness these things and are telling you what they are feeling. Primary sources can be very, very valuable, obviously, because they're there, they're a witness to it. They can also do a good job of portraying the feelings. So lots of times they had mentioned in their diaries. You think about the number of soldiers that have written down what was going on while they were over there fighting. Help us experience firsthand what they were feeling, seeing, thinking, and things like that. So primary sources are super, super valuable to us. The problem with primary sources is lots of times we write down our first reaction, and sometimes our first reaction is wrong. I'll give you an example. I was in my first year of teaching when September 11th happened, and I remember the secretary walking upstairs, pulling me out of the class and saying, a plane just hit one of the Twin Towers. And I said, how did it happen? She goes, we don't know yet. It might have been an accident. And so my first reaction was, that's sad. I can't believe you'd have that kind of accident, but it sounds like it's an accident. And if I would have walked into my classroom and wrote down my feelings at that time, I would have talked about a plane having a mechanical problem and crashing in the Twin Towers, having no clue that this was actually a terrorist attack yet, because I didn't know any better at that time. And yet I would have been a primary source had I written that stuff down. And that's what we have to be careful for. You see that a lot in the news. Every news station wants to be the first one with a story out there, so they instantly put the story out there, and then sometimes they have to step back and say, we actually got that story wrong. We have to backtrack now that we know more information. This actually happened, or that actually happened. And so we have to be careful with primary sources. Just sometimes they're written in the moment, and later on we can learn that that moment might have been a wrong interpretation. Continuing on, we have secondary sources. It says historians also use secondary sources. Secondary sources are created after an event. They are created by people who were not part of the historical event. The information in secondary sources is often based on primary sources. Examples of secondary sources are biographies, encyclopedias, history books like you're reading, textbooks like you're reading. And so secondary source contains background information. Secondary sources also offer a broad view of an event. However, a historian must use primary sources to find new evidence about a subject. So what your history book is trying to say is both sources are very good. Lots of times secondary sources will read 10 different primary sources so that they got the overall view, and then say, all right, I'm going to write my history book now that I think I understand this situation by looking at a lot of different primary sources. Obviously, if we don't have any primary sources, there's no secondary source would be created. So we have to use these primary sources, and we constantly look at a number of primary sources to get it there. Primary sources, I would say, also lots of times give you a little bit more emotion. Secondary sources are written by people that didn't experience it firsthand. So I just think there's something a little bit different with that. A lot of us might have seen videos on what happened on September 11th, but I remember watching it live, the first time, experiencing it that same day of. I remember driving home from school. We had closed down school that day, and as I was driving home, F-16 fighter jets were flying over the city of Houston because Houston went on high alert because they process a lot of oil there, and they thought they would be a target now that we realized this was an attack. And just the fear that as I drove home going, this is scary, this is for real, we literally have F-16 fighter jets patrolling our skies, ready to shoot down planes, was an emotion I was not ready for, that I got to experience because I lived through that thing firsthand. Continuing on to page 2, it says this: we have to decide if the sources are reliable, and that is a big key for us to go with that. So it says, suppose you were studying the history of England and you wanted to know how ancient people lived. You might look at a book called the Domesday Book. This book was created in 1086 by administrators under William I. The book is a primary source from that period. It contains information about the people of England at the time it was written. The Domesday Book is a long list of manors, those are like castles, and the names of their owners. It includes details about how many workers work the land. It lists the number of fish ponds, mills, and animals owned by each person. It also estimated the value of each property. The historian's job is to analyze and interpret the information from the primary sources. They consider where and when a source was created. They also look for the reasons that the source was created. Was it a secret letter? Was it a document created for the king, such as the Domesday Book? Was it written so that all people in a town or country would read it? So we have this book they're talking about, and we have to decide if it's reliable or not. And what they're trying to get at is, they're trying to figure out the value of a property. Now, there's a good reason we want to know the value of the property. We want to know how much taxes we can collect off that property. So now imagine if the king said, hey, I want you to create this book. The king would be motivated to say your land is worth a lot of money because then the king could charge you a lot of taxes. And so the historian's job is to say who told them to write this book so that they know is it reliable or not. If I know the king was told to create the book or the king told someone to create that book, I might look at the value of each property and say the value might be a little high, where if the people themselves and each person said, I'm going to go to farm and ask them how many animals they have and what they think their land is worth. Because the people might say it's not worth as much, so they don't pay as much taxes. So that's what historians are constantly working at so they can decide if the source that they're looking at is reliable or not. Next section, the point of view. It says historians interpret the document and the reasons it was created. Then they form an opinion about whether the source is trustworthy and reliable in its facts. This step is important since each source was written with a particular point of view or general attitude about people or life. The authors of primary sources use their points of view to decide what information is important and what to include in the document. Historians evaluate a primary source to find its point of view. They decide if it has a trustworthy viewpoint. 6, as we go through this, I'm going to constantly remind you that these next things we talk about, how important it is for you to realize it's just a statement of fact. We all read things from our certain points of view. We all have what we're going to talk about next. There's bias in us. And as we look at other information, we just have to see how much of that is coming out in the information. So I'm a lot older than you guys, obviously, and so I look at things with a different point of view than you'll look at things at. That's just a fact of life. That doesn't make it right or wrong. It's just how we look at things. So us old people, we like to always say, oh, you young kids, you don't know how good you have it because when I was a kid, I had to do this. That's my point of view, okay? You might hear that and say, Mr. Bauer, I have it just as hard or harder than you do, things like that. So we need to understand that point of view becomes a major emphasis of that. You should have through number 7 filled in now. We'll start moving to number 8 as we read the next paragraph. Sometimes a point of view is expressed as a bias. A bias is an unreasoned, emotional judgment about people and events. Sources with a bias cannot always be trusted. Okay, so you have your definition of bias, and it's definitely true. It's unreasoned, and it's an emotional judgment and opinion. What I need to encourage you on is to understand we all have those things. So lots of times we're going to have recess, and we're going to play boys versus girls. And I naturally want the boys to win because I'm biased toward them because I'm a boy. Or if we were playing young versus old, I'm going to go old timers because I'm old, and so I'm naturally biased toward those. Now those are kind of silly examples of how bias plays in there. I might be biased toward the Green Bay Packers. And so if you ask me who's winning the Super Bowl, the Green Bay Packers. Well, sometimes that's unreasoned because the Green Bay Packers might not be very good. But every year if you ask me who's going to win the Super Bowl, I'm going to say the Green Bay Packers because I'm biased toward them. Sometimes it gets very emotional. You guys can see that in current events with what's happening with social justice in the world. That's very an emotional thing that people are biased to as far as I'm going to become very emotional. Now that doesn't mean that's wrong. It doesn't necessarily to say, hey, I think what's happening in America is completely wrong. That can be true. I just have to make sure my emotions never cloud my judgment in reading into something. And so sometimes when I become so biased to something or I become too emotional to something, I don't allow myself to see the other side of the story. And I have to make sure I can see the other side of the story, and so that my bias never clouds that. So as we read through this, guys, I think some of the easy things you'll see in your history book is, your history book is made for Americans. You live in America. We wrote a history book for America. So when we start talking about different events that are happening, we're going to be very pro-American in our books. We're not going to tell the bad things that America did with certain things because that would make us look pretty bad. As I go on to the next section, we can see that we got to keep that in mind, and now it's going to talk about the questions that we have to ask as we start to then take what we know and start to be able to talk about those things. So as you move on here, so as we get going here, when historians write about an event, they interpret the information from primary sources to draw conclusions and make inferences. Making an inference means choosing the most likely explanation for the facts at hand. Sometimes the inference is simple. For example, if you see a person who's wearing a raincoat walking into a room with a dripping umbrella, you can infer that it's raining outside. The dripping umbrella and the raincoat are evidence that combine with your prior knowledge about weather to infer that it's raining. Making inferences about historical events is more complex. Historians check the evidence in primary sources and compare it to sources already known to be trustworthy. Then they look at secondary sources that express different points of view about an event. In this way, historians try to get a clear, well-rounded view of what happened. The inference they make is how they explain what happened in the past. This explanation is based on the evidence in primary and secondary sources. For example, you might read the Domesday Book to analyze the types of animals raised in 1086. You could add this knowledge to additional evidence from another source about grain that was planted. Then you could think about what you know to be true about food. You might use all of this information to make an inference about the types of food people ate in 11th century England. Okay, guys, this is just telling us, hey, we got to do some making inferences and drawing conclusions. History might prove those inferences incorrect later on as we learn more and more. But what it comes down to is, as historians look at pieces of evidence, they're going to take everything they can see, they're going to look at it from every point of view possible, and they're going to draw their conclusion to say, this is what I think happened. Later on in history, we might make new discoveries, we might find new information, we might develop new technologies that can prove those things false. But reality is we got to come up with our best possible conclusion to be able to do those things. Okay, so you should have been cranking through number 9 and 10 as we were getting those things answered. Looking at history, it says professional historians become experts on their historical subject. Historians gather artifacts and data about a subject and then write what they have learned from the study. Such writing may become an article in a scholarly journal or magazine. It may become a book on the specific subject. In most cases, historical books and articles are reviewed by other scholars for accuracy. Experts in the field will review the sources and write their own articles. They evaluate how the historian has interpreted the facts. This study of historical interpretation is called historiography. Historians must keep accurate notes and be careful that their inferences are reasonable. Okay, so you can see you have the vocabulary word scholarly there, and that just, it says, the definition at the bottom of the page. Concerned with academic learning or research. And so when I'm from a scholarly magazine, scholarly magazines are for one purpose. It's what the professors of colleges are writing for. In other words, what the top people in each field will write to those magazines because it's for the purpose of educating people. And so historians have to be able to back up their inferences with their data to be able to prove to them that, hey, this is accurate and scholarly, and we're going to do a good review of that. Okay. Final page on your, if you're on the online, you obviously have 2 pages if you're working out of your textbook. It says let's focus a little bit on research as we do these things. Some historians keep their areas of study very narrow. For example, someone could spend an entire career investigating the events that occurred on a single day, such as a day in the year of AD 79 that Mount Vesuvius, a volcano in the region that is now Italy, erupted and destroyed the city of Pompeii. This subject is a finite place and time. Other historians focus on broader subjects. For example, some historians study the economic history of the period. Others study the political history of a country during a certain period of time. Still others might study military history, the history of medicine, or the history of technology in a certain place. So as we start to talk about what I want to study, you can't be too broad. In other words, I'm not just history. Lots of times I'll become an expert in, let's say, World War II, and that's a plenty broad subject. Like your book said, I can get really specific, though. Some people they pour their whole life into Mount Vesuvius and everything that happened with that eruption and how it destroyed Pompeii and the things like that. Drawing conclusions. A conclusion is a final decision that is reached by reasoning. You draw conclusions all the time. For example, you may notice that a friend often wears t-shirts from music concerts that he has attended. You might also remember that he can never get together on Thursday nights because he has guitar lessons on Thursdays. Based on these two clues, you could draw the conclusion that your friend is probably interested in music. Historians draw conclusions in the same way. They look for facts and evidence in their primary and secondary sources. Then they use their reasoning to make a judgment or draw that conclusion. We do it all the time, and the more obviously evidence you have, the better your conclusion or the stronger your conclusion will be. So we have as much data as possible when we draw these conclusions. And what it comes down to, guys, is you're going to eventually have to get there and make your decision. Sometimes historians disagree about their interpretation of the facts. For example, historians disagree about how to evaluate the historical figure of Genghis Khan. There are historians who argue that Genghis Khan was a fierce and bloodthirsty warrior. Some have expressed horror at the tremendous destruction that Genghis Khan's fierce soldiers brought as they conquered new lands. Yet some historians see Genghis Khan differently. They look at the way Genghis Khan ruled his great Mongol Empire. Sources show that this was a time of peace, prosperity, and stability in a huge portion of Central and Eastern Asia. The people living in the Mongol Empire enjoyed a remarkable degree of religious tolerance, higher learning, and consistent laws. Which conclusion is correct? Was Genghis Khan a ruthless warrior or a strong, intelligent leader of a great land? A historian may rely on evidence to support either position. However, it's the job of the historian to evaluate the primary sources and explain why both interpretations can be argued. In other words, if we were going to answer that question a different way, which conclusion is correct? Both are. If I was one of the people that got conquered by Genghis Khan's army and he slaughtered my family, I would go with the first interpretation, wouldn't I? That he's this ruthless warrior that slaughtered people and came in and did terrible, terrible things. And yet, let's say I am a Mongol in his empire, I might view it the completely opposite way. Yeah, we went and conquered people, but after we conquered them, there was this time of religious tolerance, higher learning, consistent laws. It was a great time. Genghis Khan is a great leader. And so that's where you can see point of view and bias comes in a little bit to decide if I was conquered by him or I was conquering with him. Can give me two different things. And so historians have to be able to see it from both point of views. Now, the challenge for us is, let's say I'm that first person. My people got conquered by Genghis Khan. And so I have that first conclusion jump into my mind that says he's this bloodthirsty, horrific warrior. But then as I was under his kingdom and there's peace and there's religion tolerance, I have to also be able to step back and say, he's still an intelligent leader. Now, so often we don't do that. So often we get our one point of view and we refuse to see it from the other side. And we have to be able to be open-minded enough, sixth grade, as we look at history and as we go through living our lives, to understand that there's always multiple sides to every story. And too often we only hear one story and we believe that side and off we go with it, and we miss the whole other side of the story. So it's my encouragement as you study history and just anything in life, make sure you're trying to get as complete a picture as you possibly can. Do not react right away, but gather as much evidence as you can from other points of view. Okay, hopefully you got those 15 questions on your notes filled in as we went through this. You have that worksheet sitting there alongside it that'll have the answers that are part of the notes, or you can go back in your book to make sure you understand that and have the correct answers. And the big takeaway from the day is, as we look at this past, guys, we got to make sure we're understanding the different sources that we use, but making sure those sources are trustworthy so that the conclusions we draw are good conclusions.